Welcome to another of our makeup lectures. Sorry about my health the last couple of weeks. Things seem to be a bit better. In our last class, we were talking about how French art is ricocheting generation by generation from one style to the next. So we saw the sort of confusing style of mannerism in the 16th century give way in the 17th century to a much more rational style, clear, rational style of the Baroque in its particular French variation. Then in the 18th century, we saw that staid French classicism of the Baroque give way to a much more flamboyant style during the Rococo period of the 18th century. What we're going to see in this particular screencast is how that Rococo style inspires a reaction at the end of the 18th century in the next movement, which we call neoclassicism. It's a return to a clear and balanced and methodical kind of composition that is very much reminiscent of Poussin. So this sort of pendulum swing of styles characterizes much of French art from the 16th through to actually the early part of the 19th century. The change in the 18th century that we see, this change toward neoclassicism, is in fact reflective of a broader change in outlook in France and eventually across Europe. It coincides with the rise of the Enlightenment. This is a period of history dominated by a group of French thinkers known as the philosophes. Voltaire is perhaps the best known of these French philosophers, or philosophes, and they are advocating very strongly for improving civic virtue. They want people to be better citizens, and they think very strongly that the best way to do that is through education. I think this is something that we still believe in today. In fact, it's the model for modern educational systems, is the idea that whatever you're learning here, even in an art history class, it makes you become a better citizen. It broadens your horizons. It gives you more reference points as you make crucial decisions. For Voltaire, he advocated very strongly for studying history. And by studying history, he said, we can find rational moral lessons for modern behavior. I think that old adage that those who do not study the past are doomed to repeat it should come to mind in this respect. Voltaire wants us to study the past so that we can in fact become better citizens of our present day society. And these moral lessons that can be mined by studying history, Voltaire referred to them in the Latin as exemplum virtutis, which I don't think you need to know Latin to sort of figure this out. It's an example of virtue, exemplum virtutis. These are these rational moral lessons that we can learn by studying society, or excuse me, by studying history. The scene that Jacques-Louis David, perhaps the greatest neoclassical painter, shows us is a scene from Roman history. So again, he's studying ancient history. These are three sons very early in Roman history, around the 7th century BCE, well before the empire. These are the three sons of Horatius, who are swearing to take up arms to fight in battle. They are going to fight as a good parallel the three sons of their enemy, and this will then establish the early history of Rome, the Republic of Rome, a period of freedom. Notice how David takes the idea of the three brothers as the basic motif for all of his compositional choices. They embrace in lockstep. We see the three legs, bam, 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 placed against the floor. The three arms together as one. The father holding the three swords whose forms spread out from the hilt, very much like the three arms spread out from the elbow. That's not the way to hold a sword. It's a good way to lose fingers. But David doesn't worry about that. He wants the composition to work. Also notice the other threes that we see. We see three arches in the background, for example, three adult women at the right, a mother with two children. Again, threes are everywhere in the composition. That's that sort of rational, methodical kind of composition that David learned from looking back at paintings by Poussin. And in fact, you would be forgiven for mistaking this for a Poussin work, because again, it's a revival of that particular kind of style. Now, one of the sisters is secretly engaged to one of the enemy sons. So she's in a lose-lose situation based on this oath that she's witnessing. She's either going to lose a brother or a fiancé, and none of the rest of the family knows this. So there's a high sense of drama here. Of course, we know it because we know our Roman history. But what's the moral lesson? What's the exemplum virtutis? Well, on the one hand, of course, with the brothers, it's the idea of a fidelity to a higher cause. That's, I think, the central part. And because the cause is greater than themselves, they're going to sacrifice everything. That idea of sacrifice for a greater cause even extends to the daughter, that she too must deny her personal interests for the greater good. And I think this is a key element of this story, and one that's, I don't know, for my money, lost in modern America. We don't often talk about personal sacrifice for the greater good. And it's something we need to hear more about, I think. Sometimes the community is stronger, more important than our individual interests. And that certainly is what Jacques-Louis David's message is. In this particular case, the date is very important, 1784. You'll notice it's just 5 years before the French Revolution of 1789. Now, the French Revolution didn't come from nowhere. Sentiments about rising up, fighting for a greater cause were very much in the air throughout the 1780s. And Jacques-Louis David was right on the front lines of this. He was a member of the most radical wing of the Revolutionary Party and friends with all of the leaders that would eventually rise up in 1789, and stayed very, very close to French politics throughout the rest of his career. After the revolution, he was asked by the leaders of the revolution to paint this portrait of a martyr to the revolution, martyr to the cause. He was a journalist, very good friends with David. In fact, David was able to gain access to the crime site and drew the face of Marat from death, right? Not from life, at the actual crime scene. Marat was a journalist. He had advocated in print for the rights of the common man, and his writings were very much some of the fuel that led to the revolutionary fire in 1789. He continued to write anti-royalist editorials even after the revolution. And at the same time, he had a terrible case of eczema, skin disease, and he had to spend hours in a bath filled with ointment, working through the discomfort. This is his dedication to the good for other people, the rights of the common man. Well, for this advocacy, he was assassinated by a counter-revolutionary, a supporter of the royals, of the French royalty. And she gives him a letter. Her name is Charlotte Corday. She gives him a letter asking to see him, to seek his help on gaining more rights for the common man, more good works. And as she comes into him working in the ointment bath, she knifes him, she murders him. Now, it is David's job, of course, to show him as a martyr. That's really what the commission is all about. This is what the heads of the revolution wanted, was to see Marat as a martyr to the cause. And in order to do this, what David did was he turned back to Renaissance examples, in particular the Vatican Pietà by Michelangelo, with the slung arm of Christ being picked up very directly in this image of Marat. even the arm, the other slack arm across his hips, now holding the letter, deriving quite directly from Michelangelo's sculpture. And this is a way that David uses this reference to a more classical past as a way to enhance the meaning of the image. Just as Christ died for the sins of mankind, so Marat died for the good of French citizenry. At the same time, David makes this wonderful statement of how the pen is mightier than the sword. She may have knifed him, but his words will live on well past his death. And he places right in the foreground the quill pen, immediately, still stained with ink, immediately next to the knife that is stained with his blood. Well, like I said, David was very deeply involved with French politics, and he became friends with Napoleon very early on, in the early 1890s. In 1790s. In 1799, there was a political coup following the revolution that put Napoleon in power in France. At that point in his career, he was not in France. He was abroad leading the French troops as they colonized territories around the Mediterranean. And here, David shows him coming home to France to take the reins of government, crossing the Alps from Italy, and having carved his name in the rocks beneath the horse's hooves, along with other people who had crossed the Alps to conquer Hannibal and Charlemagne's names, carved next to Bonaparte's on the rocks. What David wants to show us is somehow this is the will of destiny, and it's almost as if he's swept by the clouds, swept by the winds, up over the Alps, as if nature itself wants Napoleon to come back to France, to reign as he rightly should. As a neoclassical work, of course, he's again turning to the past, especially to classical periods of history, rational periods of history. The Renaissance is one great inspiration for our neoclassical artists. The other is ancient Greek art, and certainly the rearing horse of Napoleon, held in check simply by force of will, glaring but his loosen the reins, seems to rely back on these horsemen from the Parthenon in ancient Greece, works that David would well have known through reproductions. And Napoleon looks very much like our Athenians, easy in the saddle as the horse rears up, in charge of the powers of nature. Well, in the National Gallery, we have a picture of Napoleon after having been crowned as emperor. It's a bit of an irony, isn't it, that the French fought against a king, beheaded the king in order to achieve independence and democracy, and yet it wound up leading to Napoleon as an emperor. But here we see him in his imperial persona. At the same time, he's not dressed as an emperor per se, but as a military colonel, which is, of course, his legacy. He came to power because he had been in the military. And he still is the chief in charge of reviewing troops. You'll notice that he's about to go review the troops. He's risen from his chair. His sword is laid there. He's about to strap it on and head out to review the troops at dawn. There are various details that add to this meaning that he's rising to greet the troops. First, you'll notice the throne has these bees on it. Here, those were imperial symbols. The bee looks very much like the French fleur-de-lis, and it was adopted by Napoleon as part of his royal insignia. So that is his imperial throne that he's rising from to put on his sword and go out and review the troops. The other details that add to the idea of him rising to meet the troops is that he's been his clothes are run back up. He's been working all night, right? That's the basic idea, that he's not sort of getting out of bed to do this, but he's getting up from work, and that he never sleeps. And the way that David gets this across is his clothing is wrinkled everywhere we look. It's not finely pressed. He didn't just put it on, but he's been sitting up all night. His hair is tousled, not well combed at the top. In his hand, the gold object that you see in the detail is a snuff box, using snuff, which is a mixture of tobacco and cocaine, to stay up all night. And what's he been doing as he stays up all night? He's been working on the new code of law, the Napoleonic Code of Law, and we can see those papers directly on the table. We see other books he's been using as references and maps beneath the table, behind his feet. So Napoleon is a hard-working emperor, even though, of course, he doesn't have to be. This is probably entirely a fiction on David's part to flatter Napoleon, a bit of visual propaganda, if you will, to extol his character the way he wants to be seen. The other details that add to this theme of working all night and now going to review the troops is that the candle on his lamp, the candles, I should say, have burned clean out. One barely with a bit of wax left and a bit of the tip, and the other one, as you can see, recently burned all the way out, and the smoke rising from it. So he's been burning the midnight oil, if you will, burning the candle, and then the clock on the wall tells us that it's just after 4 in the morning, and as such, this is really the crack of dawn. But for him, it's not any kind of alarm to wake him up. He simply is rising from one kind of work to move into another. Now, as a neoclassical work, again, what David wants to do is to try to aggrandize Napoleon, idealize him in some way. And the pose is very much derived from any number of different ancient Greek statues that he could well have seen. This is a sculpture of Apollo, right, the sun god, and that certainly is something that is great for Napoleon. Apollo, the sun god, the son of another god, sculpted by the man who designed the Parthenon, holding in one hand a small scroll, very much like Napoleon holds the snuff box. The other hand, now altered to the famous Napoleonic pose, inserted inside his waistcoat to keep his hand warm. The painter Ingres, the RES is all but silent. The painter Ingres was a pupil of Jacques-Louis David. David had a great number of pupils, and many of the next generation of artists in France were pupils of David. And this picture, this well-known image, was painted for Napoleon's sister, who was living in Italy. Now, Ingres had entered some pictures in the Royal Academy's annual salon, and one of the things the Royal Academy did was they gave a prize for best pictures, various jurors' prizes, and one of them was known as the Prix de Rome, the Rome Prize. And what the Prix de Rome did was it gave a young, up-and-coming artist a 2-year, all-expenses-paid trip to Rome to study the great art of antiquity, the great art of the Renaissance, on the dime of the Royal Academy. And Ingres won that prize in 1801, went to Rome, funded by the Royal Academy for 2 years, but because Italy had been controlled by Napoleon, remember we saw him crossing the Alps from Italy back to France, there were a great number of French patrons living in Rome, such as Napoleon's sister. And Ingres was able to make a career in Rome, stayed there for the next 20 years, working for French patrons living in French-controlled Italy in the early 19th century. Now, the term odalisque is a term that the French used for a woman who lived in the harem of the Sultan. This was a stereotypical view of Middle Eastern culture, where the Sultan would keep multiple wives, would be sexually deviant in the eyes of the French, lewd and lascivious, and the odalisque was just one of many of the harem girls that belonged to the Sultan. This interest in Middle Eastern themes, again, came directly from Napoleon. In addition to conquering Italy, Napoleon had also conquered Egypt in the 1890s. Here's a later reimagining of Napoleon finding the Sphinx buried in the sand. This would have happened in the 1790s, although this is painted in the 1860s. Napoleon's conquering of Egypt led to a huge interest in North African themes in French art. Not only do we see Ingres' painting of a harem girl, but this also leads to a great interest in Egyptian motifs in French furniture, in what we call empire-style furniture. And that would have suited Napoleon perfectly because, of course, what greater emperors were there than the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, right? And so this helped to spread that style through France in the late 18th and early 19th century. So with Ingres, we have another aspect of this interest in North African culture after Napoleon. It continued throughout the rest of the 19th century. Here is one of numerous variations that Ingres did on the theme of the odalisque throughout his career, now some 35 years later. All of these are based on studying Titian, paintings by the great Renaissance artist Titian, whose works he had seen in Paris and would continue to seek out while living in Italy and even after he'd returned to France. The painting in the Walters on the left was painted after he had come back. Remember that neoclassical artists are often quoting from Renaissance works. Now, this French interest in North African culture continues well after Napoleon. Part of this came from the fact that in addition to Napoleon's conquests in Egypt, France itself had invaded and colonized Algeria in 1830. And indeed, the French remained the colonizing power in Algeria all the way until 1962, when the Algerians finally fought for independence and won it against the French. So regardless of any influence of Titian, with these works, we see this interest in Middle Eastern culture that was very strong in French art throughout the 19th century. It raises a term that we often use in analyzing these anymore, a more recent deconstructivist term. We refer to this interest in Middle Eastern culture on the part of the French or other colonizing powers as Orientalism, Western Europe's image of the Middle East. And it's been pointed out that these images are not particularly archaeological or anthropological, that they are actually very selective in what aspects of Middle Eastern culture, what aspects of Islam that they want to show. And what we see is that the artists in Western Europe who give us images of Middle Eastern culture, of Islamic culture, choose images of depravity. In this case, focusing on the sexually deviant behavior of the Sultan, the wanton sexuality of the women. And the whole point of this is to promote the idea that Western culture is superior, that the colonization of North Africa on the part of the French is in fact justified, because their culture is not up to the sort of sophistication and has not evolved as far as European culture has. So we see often that Orientalist images of the Middle East, come sort of packed with what we call ideology, the sort of unexpressed ideas of a society, the unexpressed prejudices of society. Well, neoclassicism was everywhere in the late 18th and early 19th century. It was strong in other countries in Europe, and we'll see it's also in America. Here we're looking at England now, and one of the few women artists we get to see prior to the modern period, simply because many of them did not have the same opportunities to study as men did. They didn't have access to the nude model, for example, and many of the academies had barred them. Angelika Kauffmann was a Swiss painter who had emigrated to England and became part of the English Royal Academy. And she gives us here another story from ancient history that's intended again as what Voltaire called an exemplum virtutis, like what Jacques-Louis David had given us. A story from ancient history that is meant to teach us moral lessons that are applicable to the modern day. So, Cornelia. Cornelia is the mother of the two boys you see on your left. Each of them will grow up to become a leader of ancient Rome in the 2nd century BCE. And the story that Kauffmann gives us is a story of how the good parenting of Cornelia led to the good leadership of the two boys, because they both became champions of the common man. This is again a theme that's important to the Enlightenment, to our painters during this period. So the painting is a painting of her story, her virtue, how the virtuous behavior of a mother will be passed on to the virtuous behavior of her children. It's very much a woman's story. And the story is somewhat humorous. It's also, even though painted by a woman, quite sexist. Cornelia, in the center, standing upright and white, is visited by her neighbor. And the neighbor's kind of one of those snarky, Real Housewives kind of neighbor who comes over with a jewel box and says, "I want to show you my jewels. Look how beautiful they are." And she's doing this just to sort of, poke at Cornelia. And Cornelia's daughter sort of looks at the jewels, and we saw that with Poussin, that girls go for jewels, men go for armor, right? And the little daughter is looking at the jewels, and the neighbor in red is asking, so tell me, where are your jewels? I want to compare mine to yours. It's such a nasty little thing, isn't it? But what Cornelia does, of course, is she gets the upper hand by saying, "Here are my boys, here are my sons. They are my jewels, and they are far finer than anything that you own." And there we see them coming along. And so Cornelia presents the older brother, who's much more mature, and he's bringing along his impish little brother. And the whole idea is, of course, this idea of passing along virtue. Cornelia has taught the older son, and the older son is in the process of teaching the younger son. And those two boys will now grow up to be great leaders of ancient Rome. And of course, the story for us in the late 18th century is that direct parenting, in particular maternal parenting, is an important part of proper civic virtue, and that Cornelia becomes for us the role model for modern women, priorities in place and passing them along to her kids. John Singleton Copley is another British classicist, but he had actually grown up in the colonies, in what is now the United States. But when the war broke out in 1776, he returned to Britain. He was a Tory. He supported the British monarchy, did not support the independence of the colonies. And so as the war broke out, Copley returned with his family to England and painted this after having returned to London. And he shows us a relatively current event, something that happened in 1749. In that time period, in 1749, the boy in the water, Brooke Watson, here's a close-up of Brooke Watson, was swimming in the Havana harbor and had been attacked by a shark. And according to the story, the shark had hit him once, attacked him once, and was coming back to finish the job when he was miraculously rescued by his colleagues on the boat. So in the picture, it's a little blurred, but he's already lost his right leg below the knee. It doesn't sort of disappear into the water. It's missing because the shark's already had an appetizer. And that huge animal, look at his tail behind the boat, is now coming back, and they're going to save him from certain death, although at this point it seems unclear that that's going to happen. Now, why was there interest in this story from the 1740s 30 years later? Well, it turns out that Brooke Watson had become a member of Parliament and was the Lord Mayor of London in the 1770s. And so there was this great interest in how he lost his leg and this incredible story from his youth. And Copley is painting for that particular market. There are actually two versions of this, the other one in Boston, one downtown. Now, one wonders, we've talked about neoclassicism as offering these examples of virtue, even though this is a contemporary scene. Could it be an exemplum virtutis, an example of virtue, or some sort of allegory? Could it be, for example, could it be an example of how when we work together, we can achieve miracles? How important it is to bond together to save one of our own, even bonding together between races. The white man spearing at the fish, the black man directly behind him, helping with the rope that's going to help pull Watson in away from the shark. That idea of bonding together for the greater good is a common theme in the neoclassical Enlightenment period, and it could well be an exemplum from this work. Others, however, have suggested a political overtone, that perhaps Copley devises the scene as a great allegory for what's going on in the world. Remember, he had left America for England because America had split from the English Empire. Could Watson be a metaphor for the English Empire? He's lost part of his body, just as England had lost part of its political body. And he'd lost it to the native forces of America. In this case, the shark as a metaphor for the rebellious colonies, taking something away from Mother England. Well, that certainly is something that's out there in the discussions of this work. I don't know whether or not the people in the 18th century had seen that meaning or not. They didn't write about art the same way we do today, so they may well have thought it without actually ever writing it down. Now again, neoclassicism, which relies heavily on earlier examples to amplify the meaning of the work. Copley has reached out to all sorts of examples from Renaissance and classical art, and he does it very smartly to enhance the meaning of the work. The pose of Brooke Watson, you might ask, why is he naked when everyone else is clothed if he's just been swimming? Well, maybe he got naked to go swimming, but at the same time, it refers us back to a naked prototype for the image of Watson. Either Laocoon himself or one of his sons, I think is probably the son on the left. Laocoon was a priest in Troy who had tried to warn the Trojans about taking that horse from the Greeks. And for this, the gods punished him by sending sea serpents to kill both him and his sons. Well, certainly this adds to the meaning of Watson and the Shark, where a monster from the sea is coming to attack Watson. Watson is miraculously saved, whereas Laocoon's sons are not. So this is certainly the basis for the body of Watson and helps to account for his nudity. Other images that came into play with this is the man spearing the shark seems to borrow very closely from a Raphael picture. Copley had recently been to Rome from London to study art, and would have been able to see all of these things on his travels through Rome. So this adds to the meaning, of course, as well, because St. Michael is vanquishing a supernatural force in the same way that our figure at the stern of the ship is also vanquishing this incredible force of nature. And then the figures rescuing Watson seem derived from another Raphael, cartoon he had done for a series of tapestries that were woven to hang in the Sistine ceiling, or in the Sistine Chapel, below Michelangelo's ceiling. And this is where Christ tells the apostles to throw your nets on the other side, and you will catch more fish than you've ever seen. And so we see the apostles now dragging the fish nets up, miraculously filled with fish, and how Copley has borrowed those very figures as they try to drag miraculously Watson back to the ship. So again, neoclassical art, drawing from these references from past art, but focusing on classical periods, the Renaissance, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and doing it to amplify the meaning of the works. Our last neoclassical work is in America, because neoclassicism was really everywhere. I mean, Copley started his career in the Americas before the Revolution. And here, Gilbert Stuart gives us a portrait, probably the most famous portrait of George Washington, called the Lansdowne Portrait, named after an earlier owner of it. And he, too, is relying on classical prototypes for the pose of George Washington. In this case, it's another statue of Apollo, the sun god, which makes a great image for idealizing a figure. The famous Apollo Belvedere. In the 18th century, when Stuart painted Washington, this was believed to be the single greatest example of classical sculpture, the greatest surviving example of anything the Greeks had ever done. It had that reputation. And so it made a wonderful image to idealize George Washington, to make him into the greatest living person, modeled after the greatest surviving Greek sculpture. And a number of artists used that pose of the Apollo Belvedere for various images of George Washington. This is one of the many murals in the Capitol, under the dome of the U.S. Capitol. And it shows us the moment when Washington steps down as a military leader at the end of the war. This is a really important moment in American history, because he did not become president by military coup. He became president by the will of the people. He had stepped down as general. He had retired to private life and then was called back into service by the election. So Trumbull, John Trumbull, paints this moment when Washington is now stepping down as a general, taking up private life, and then will eventually be called back, which happens later. With Stuart's picture, where he's in almost the exact same pose, he's also stepping down. In this case, he's stepping down as president. And again, this is a key moment for the young country. Washington's choosing, after 2 terms, to step down. He will not reign for the rest of his life. He will not become a ruler like the kings of Europe, which he could probably have easily done if he wanted to. But instead, he's retiring. He's handing over the reins of government. And there are a number of things that sort of add to this meaning of him willfully stepping down, turning over the reins of government. First, of course, he stepped out of the presidential chair directly behind him. And his sword is pointed downward. This is, in fact, a standard scene we see, learned through ages of representations, of a warrior after battle, pointing his sword downward. He no longer needs to hold it up to fight. His second hand, the one that's outstretched, points over books with a quill pen in an inkwell. Again, there's this theme that we saw with David of the pen being mightier than the sword. But I think it's also Washington, at the crossroads, if you will. His old life was military leader and president. Those are on your right. And he's pointing to his new life now. He's going to be a scholar. He's going to apply his experience as general, as president. He's going to take these ideas, he's going to apply them to the greater good of humanity by writing, by practicing the arts. Below the table, there are copies of the history of the Revolution, a copy of the Constitution. Under the table, these all add to the meaning of the left-hand part of the image, the life of the mind, which is where Washington is turning now, having turned his back, quite literally, on public service in 2 different forms, military and political. And this shift toward the life of the mind is good for the country. And Stuart adds to that by giving us this wonderful little vignette out the window of a rainbow just off the elbow of Washington. Bright skies ahead. Rainbow, of course, comes from the Bible. At the end of the flood, Noah sees a rainbow, and it's God's promise that you'll never have to go through this again. And American artists co-opt that theme regularly, as America is the new promised land after the flood, after the deluge, after the war. We have moved on to a greater future. And in fact, we find many times in American history, in the late 18th, early 19th century, Americans talking about themselves as pilgrims to the promised land, people who have survived the great devastation in order to found now the land that has been promised by God. And Gilbert Stuart picks up on all of those ideas in this strongly neoclassical work, spreading from France through all other countries and eventually, of course, to America as well.